and turn over to our speaker for today, Kim Miller from Santa Barbara. Kim, want to take it away?
Okay. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to me. I hardly ever come here, but I'm so glad that this group exists to share. The idea of a crop that sustains humanity is integral to the whole concept of the dual evolution of spirit and matter in incarnation, and the evolutionary wave of humanity in progressing to greater self-realization. Because we can't have any kind of physical embodiment without physical sustenance. And the kind of embodiment we have historically as a humanity, as we're taught in the Secret Doctrine, is of ever more specialized vestures coming from the most spiritual, ethereal forms through the guidance of the Lords of Light into progressively more grosser forms into the psychical and then astral and physical realms. And corresponding with those evolved bodies is a source of sustenance for those bodies. And here in this image, we can see one of those physical manifestations of sustenance given by the great brothers of humanity who have, our forebears really, who have allowed our human form to be sustained. This particular grain, corn, comes specifically in the Northern America area, and the Americas, also the South America. But of course, it's related to the other staffs of life, like wheat and bulgur wheat, sorghum, rice. Different locations in the world had different staffs of life. The phrase staff of life comes actually originally from the Bible, where it's actually used in kind of a warning sense that if you're an ungodly people and don't do as God says, then he will break the staff of life and you won't be sustained and you'll be starving, basically. So if we think of a staff, it's a rod, a stick that holds something up. So the phrase staff of life is symbolizing that which holds up our physical form. And so that's why when we see this quote from Hermes, corn served as the first staff for all the races that made the New World their home. It thus provided a symbolic and biological keynote for the spiritual and physical evolution that can take place in the future. So it's interesting to look at corn, especially this picture is very, very nicely showing it, because it really does show a multitude of variety of specific centers of differentiation. If you look at the different colors of kernels on some of these multicolored kernels, it really shows that the genetics of one kernel of corn is different than the next kernel of corn, ever so slightly, based on the pigmentation. But this is related to the fact that every one of these kernels is fertilized by a separate pollen grain. And it's analogous to the human form in that the humans have many centers of organization on the astral plane and, well, even the physical plane. But on the physical plane, we have several organs which function for certain processes like respiration or purification of the blood or digestion or cogitation, neural centers that allow us to sense and perceive. But as humans have evolved these vestures also on the inner plane. There are, we're told, 7 times 7 primordial fires, and there are invisible centers that I don't have the wisdom to speak of at all. But the corn that we see here is a symbol of that, because every little kernel that you see there is really the product of a union between, symbolically, spirit and matter. Spirit, the pollen grain; matter, the ovule, the egg. And they're each pollen grain separately fertilizes a separate egg. So every kernel there is a separate egg. So in a sense, you're eating a lot of fertilized eggs there when you eat a corn cob. And all of those different colors represent different little brothers and sisters, different zygotes, different embryos, with all slightly different genetics. So in a sense, then, they're representing a unity, and yet within that structure of unity, there is an incredible amount of differentiation and specialization. The Zuni Indians, I think it's the Zuni, sorry, to really know, one must go to, the easiest way is theosophytrust.org and look at the symbol article on corn. But we're going to say that we think it's the Zuni Indians had a special ritual where different colors of corn ears were placed at different loci in sacred ceremony. And like, there's red corn for one direction, black corn for another direction, white for another, yellow. And the multicolored corn was the most sacred because it combined all the different specialized directional gods and directional energies into one. So the multicolored corn represented this pulling together of disparate elements and then integrating all the powers of the potential gods within, so that when that multicolored corn was used in the ceremony, it really represented the ultimate potency of godhood in humanity. Speaking of pulling together, there's this beautiful little poem that occurred in Hermes. I remember the cornfields and a dream of oneness with all mankind that was stretched out across the land like rustling links in a golden chain. And if you've ever walked in a cornfield or seen a cornfield, you know how there is this sense of a beneficent structure of unity and commonality and shared purpose across the land, rustling links in a golden chain that represents what humans could achieve. Some of the peoples in the New World saw a corn plant as an example of a human being, and we'll get into that in just a moment. Just so we know what a corn plant is, so we know what we're talking about. Here we have an example of a corn plant. Can you see the mouse that I move?
Yes.
Yes. You can. Okay.
You can see the mouse, yeah.
Okay, great. So down below are the roots, and there are some bracing roots that are towards the top of the root structure. Then we have the stalk, and then we have nodes like you have with grasses, because this is a kind of a grass. And then, of course, the leaves, an ear of corn, possibly more. The largest ear is at the top. This is where the female structure is. And as you go up, you get the tassels at the top, which are where the male structures are. And the male parts of the male flowers are called anthers. And the anthers can create something like 6,000 pollen grains per anther. It's really crazy. So imagine all these. I mean, if there's going to be really probably at least 100,000 pollen grains created from one of these tassels. And the pollen grains could drop down to the female structure right here, but that would be kind of self-pollination, and generally most most plants in the plant kingdom are adapted to do cross-pollination so they can have genetic diversity. And this is why when you plant corn in a crop, you want to plant several of them, a lot of them in a bunch, like in a square plot. It's better not to just plant a whole long row of corn plants, because the critical thing to getting a ear of corn is to have that pollen grain pollinate the female flower below. And you need to do that in a bunch. So cornfields are best in a big square or a big circle structure. What is this? Oh. In pulling together the slides for this talk, we found that the time needed to really well organize them wasn't there. So we're just going to read what we discovered here that was interesting. This is the traditional way of planting the corn in, well, for example, the Iroquois Indians, native people, they would do the three sisters, planting squash, bean, and corn together. Actually, they're saying here, this is a report from somebody in the early 1920s listening to the Iroquois structure, talking about how they structured their agriculture. They would carefully drop the corn seeds in the hills so as not to break the germs, which had nearly burst through, so they were almost sprouted. Among the Senecas, in planting corn, the seeds of the squash and bean were sown in every seventh hill, because it was thought that the spirits of these three plants were inseparable. They were called something, which I don't want to try to unpronounce, these that sustain us. In the green corn Thanksgiving, the leader rises and says, "We give thanks to our sustainers." So the three sisters are honored in ceremonies. There would be a dance where one of the leaders would hold an armful of corn and a cake of cornbread and lead a group of people in a march around a kettle of corn soup. And this is just emblematic of one of many, many, many different rituals of the various peoples throughout the Americas that showed their respect to corn. Because, well, especially when you combined it with beans and squash, I mean, what a complete meal there. Succotash, we call it. But beans with the protein and squash and corn with the starches, those were really a very complete meal. And the people who came over from Europe were absolutely delighted to be saved, have their lives saved by the natives that met them and taught them these planting techniques. Unfortunately, in the history of the white people and the native people, we know it's not so pretty. Here's a beautiful graphic of the three sisters. On the left, we see the corn, and here we have the beans, and here's the squash. The reason they were planted together also, they would first plant the corn, let it grow up a little bit, and then about a week later, they would plant the green beans and the squash. And the green beans then would have a stalk to go up on, using the corn stalk to go up. And then the squash leaves, being very large, would shade the ground and retain moisture. This actually is a plaque memorializing an unfortunate event here, where the Denonville campaign of 1687, the Europeans who were kind of invading, they found a granary on Fort Hill, which the Senecas had built up, and they just went ahead and destroyed it. 440,000 bushels of corn were destroyed. And I translated that into gallons. That's 3.5 million gallons of corn destroyed in 1 year by the invaders. So although the cultivators of these crops were generous in sharing, didn't happen to be reciprocal in colonial times. To honor that history, there was a coin minted by the United States Mint honoring it's the women who would be planting the corn. It's also said that it's significant that, well, unlike wheat, which pretty much requires a lot of plowing, which requires a good amount of muscle and using the plow and dealing with the heavy draft animals. Corn could be planted by women easily who also had children with them. And so it was a crop that gave power to women in a sense because they could maintain it. And with this comes the seeds of civilization. When you have agriculture growing, people can be in one spot for a long time and can be sustained and then can develop specialties in their work. And so then you can have more specialized work, which then leads to a kind of growth in the economy and then the political structure. And then hopefully people have some free time to observe philosophical or religious or artistic endeavors. And so it leads to more culture. And so this is showing how in the Americas, it was led by women and corn. This is an example of a cornfield that's been planted with the Three Sisters. It's got the corn growing up, and you can see here, this is a bean plant. It's very large leaves. And then this is a squash leaf. And you can see how it's so wide, it does shade the ground and keep it moist so that they all grow together quite nicely, especially if you plant them with a fish in there at the time of planting. The corn on the cob that we get at the grocery store today is just one of hundreds of varieties of corn that have been developed by humans. And it's interesting, though, that when the eggs of the corn begin to grow on the cob, they grow first from a primordial germ, which splits in half and creates two. And then those come down in rows. And so you have pairs of rows. So if you count the number of rows in almost every corn cob, you'll find that it's an even number. So symbolically, that's interesting, you know, the primordial differentiation, spirit and matter. So here's an example of an immature corn cob with just the ovules, and it shows all those little silks. These tiny strands come from each individual very young kernel, the ovule, and female part. Every ovule has its own silk, and it's the job of pollen to get on the silk. And that's kind of, it has to happen in a certain way. I mean, if it's too wet during the time when the corn silks out, then the pollen grains don't float around. They just drip in water and they don't necessarily get on the silk tassels. So if it's too wet, that doesn't work. If it's too hot and dry, then the corn silks can kind of wither away and the pollen doesn't get on them. So there is a sensitivity to weather conditions during the time of pollination. There's about I think it's a 11-day period of optimal time for this to happen. And if you don't get pollen grains on the silks going and fertilizing those eggs, then you will not have a developed kernel. I think it's really, truly amazing to imagine this. This corn cob here has had its outer leaves pulled away. So what you would normally see is like corn leaves here, and then all these silks kind of stuffed out the end. If a pollen grain lands on the silk, it's going to grow a little tiny tube inside that silk. And that little tube will go all the way down the corn cob to whatever ovule it's at. So if we're looking at the ovule down by this person's fingers, that means that a tiny pollen grain, which is almost invisible to the eye, made a tube extended part of itself all this long length. I mean, proportionally, that's incredible. Imagine you stuck your arm out 50 blocks down the street like Rubber Man. I mean, that's essentially what the pollen tube is doing. It's amazing to imagine. It's so tiny, and it's so small, and yet it can push out an extension of itself that huge. And then the sperm cell floats down or is pushed down that little tiny tube all the way down the corn cob. And then the sperm cell meets the egg, and it becomes a zygote then. But I just find that fascinating. So here are some young corn cobs that do have been pollinated, and they're showing their gradual growth of the kernels. And if you've ever like homegrown corn, you're like, oh great, I made corn, here it is, so nice. And then you open up and you discover that like all of these are not made as corn kernels. They're just kind of little white things, and maybe there's some good yellow ones down here. Well, that's because they did not get completely fertilized, and it's usually due to weather issues and timing of that pollen release. Now, going to more philosophical ideas here, I thought I would read something that HBB said from The Secret Doctrine. This comes from page 374, just about what I was talking about evolution. She was talking about how it's a pattern in nature that giant species evolve from the infinitesimally small species. She says esoteric science agrees with this, but adds that this law applies only to what is known to it as the primary creation, the evolution of worlds from primordial atoms and the pre-primordial atom at the first differentiation of the former, and that during the period of cyclic evolution in space and time, this law is limited and works only in the lower kingdoms. It did so work during the first geological periods, from simple to complex, on the rough material surviving from the relics of the third round, which relics are projected into objectivity when terrestrial activity recommences. We're reminded of something that the Native Americans refer to of the corn people being projected into manifestation in the early worlds. It's in one of their myths, they speak of this coming down from the invisible worlds of the corn people to create humanity. No more than science, HBB continues, does the esoteric philosophy admit design or special creation. It rejects every claim to the miraculous and accepts nothing outside the uniform and immutable laws of nature. But it teaches a cyclic law, a double stream of force or spirit and of matter, which, starting from the neutral center of being, develops by its cyclic progress and incessant transformations. The primitive germ, from which all vertebrate life has developed throughout the ages, being distinct from the primitive germ from which vegetable and animal life have evolved, there are side laws whose work is determined by the conditions in which the materials to be worked upon are found by them. So here again, she's discussing the germ of vertebrate life being distinct from the germ for vegetable and animal life. And yet we see with this staff of life, the corn, the wheat, these are co-evolving with humanity. There's a law of reciprocity. Humans cultivate the grain, and the grain sustains the human form. So she says the design and the designer, if there be any, in the case of man with the wonderful structure of his limbs and his hand especially, must be placed very much farther back, and is in fact involved in the primitive germ, from which all vertebrate life certainly, and probably all life, animal or vegetable, have been slowly developed. This is as true of the primitive germ as it is false that the germ is only very much farther back than man is, for it is at an immeasurable and inconceivable distance in time, though not in space, from the origin even of our solar system. It is the many that proceed from the one, the living spiritual germs or centers of forces, each in a septenary form, which first generate and then give the primary impulse to the law of evolution and gradual slow development. The line of demarcation between ethereal, spiritual, astral, and physical evolution must be drawn. So we wanted to share that just because the idea of the multiple germs of evolution, it reminded us symbolically, it's suggestive in the corn, which has so many different germs, different locations for a nucleus of creation, which then represent each kernel. And, okay. So here's some pictures from Oaxaca, the variety of corn kernels that you can get. Green corn and green heirloom corn. There's Hopi blue corn, dented corn, just to give you some examples of all of the variety. Actually, you know what? Let me go back to this. Yeah. I think I wanted to talk about the native peoples here. So here's a ceremonial puberty ceremony for the girls in I think it's either Zuni or Hopi. I don't know. Anyway, there they are. And this is a Hopi dance, I believe, of corn dance. This is what I wanted to show you. The Zuni corn maiden, blossoming and evolving. So the Zuni saw the corn as emblematic of people, structured as people. So they drew and created and sculpted people of the corn. And so here's a corn maiden blossoming and evolving. This is made out of turquoise. And here, a Zuni corn spirit. This is carved from an antler. And, you know, it's quite suggestive, the structure of it. In the corn article, which we recommend everybody read from Hermes, that is on the website theosophytrust.org, in the symbols section, written by Helen Valborg, published in Hermes, it does have some very provocative ideas that one could consider. For example, it mentions that the growing tip of the corn and of wheat forms a cone shape, and that is suggestive of the pituitary gland, which in humans is a locus of a physical structure that could receive spiritual insight. And we see this up here too. We also see here the triad here of turquoise beads, downward pointing triad, which is an interesting thing to consider in terms of symbology. And so incarnation. And again, corn is allowing incarnation because it is providing the staff of life. Okay, now I'm going to go back to corn itself, which is interesting. Let's go actually right here. So here's corn developing from very small up into its different stages. And this is actually what I was talking about before. At this stage, when the silks come out, that's when the pollen grains from a nearby plant, 95% of the pollen that lands on the silks is from nearby plants. That's when it lands there and then starts growing its pollen tubes and fertilizing the ovules and forming the corn grains. And once it looks dry, that's when it's ready for harvest. Corn is a really interesting plant. Like sorghum and sugarcane, it undergoes a special kind of photosynthesis method that is different than most other plants. Most plants, in order to photosynthesize, they need to open up these holes in their leaves called stomata and get carbon dioxide in. And when they do that, water comes out because there's more water inside the leaf than outside. And so just natural diffusion, water goes out. So in order to photosynthesize, they need sunlight and carbon dioxide and water. But to get the CO2, or the carbon dioxide, they have to open up these holes. So they open them up and then, oh, water goes out, darn it. But I got carbon dioxide, that's good. So there's this balance between, oh, I'm losing water, or yay, I'm getting carbon dioxide. The C3 plants, the most plants in our world do this. And the carbon dioxide that goes in goes directly into a part of the cell called the mesophyll. Actually, it's this particular cell. And it begins a physical cycle, well, a chemical cycle that produces sugar, which is the energy source of plants. Corn is different. Corn has a specially evolved set of structures inside of its leaf that enable it to do something pretty special. It can open up the stomata, the hole here, and have the carbon dioxide go into a storage area called the mesophyll cell. And there it gets kind of shoved into a molecule that has 4 carbons in it. And it's stored as a 4-carbon molecule for future use, turning into sugar in this other structure that's just like the regular plants. So it can kind of pack in carbon dioxide really quickly and put it for storage later, and then close its stomata. So it can have the option of not losing water, but getting carbon dioxide in and then shutting down the stomata so that it doesn't lose any more water. This makes it adapted to hotter climates. And so scientists have been studying these C4 plants as a potential help for crops in terms of if they could possibly genetically modify some crops like rice to do this kind of C4 photosynthesis, then rice wouldn't die off in the 100-degree heat that the Earth is facing with global warming. This is an active field of research for crop scientists, trying to make crops heat and drought resistant. Corn is not perfectly drought resistant because its pollen grains, when it lands on the tassels, if drought has withered away the tassels, it won't pollinate the ear. But this metabolic process where it can grab carbon dioxide and put it into a molecule that has 4 carbons and store that for later use in the photosynthesis process is valuable and interesting. And so it's a potent plant for this time, being heat and drought resistant, as long as it's not happening during the pollination time. So this is actually maybe more than I want to go into. This is what I was just talking about. Never mind. Okay, so here's the pollen grains. Yeah. It's just showing how many pollen grains, 6,000 anthers, which have pollen grains that can shed in as few as 3 minutes, but usually takes 10 to 14 days to have all that pollen go. And, oh, here's this man. He's a Hopi, a man who has taught at the university the native techniques in the Hopi area, the desert area, of how they how they grow their crops in a desert using just rainfall. He promotes the values of resilience, stewardship, and sharing, and promotes biodiversity of the corn crops, which would help us in the future, of course, as we face global warming. I wanted to show you that, like, the problem with sometimes people of European descent think that all the Native Americans have gone away, that they all died, but it's not true. They're the invisible ethnic group sometimes. But this is an example of current group of the Indians in the New Mexico Pueblo. They're doing a corn dance. And I just wanted to mention, notice the venue. You know, one might be prejudiced in saying, oh yes, all Indians, you know, they live in cornfields and they all do a certain thing and they all, you know, but here we are next to a fancy car with these buildings and electricity, and it's beautiful, I think, how they're incorporating the history and richness of their culture and bringing it into modern life right here. It's real. And as is pretty typical, there's people of all ages participating. The whole community is out there, either as supportive watchers, as creators of rhythm and song, or letting their feet stand on the ground and create the rhythm with the earth, touching the earth. And you notice the feathers of the leaf dancer pointing to heaven, and the rhythmic dancing of the feet on the ground, touching Earth Mother. So we're going to let that go. Let's see, keep going. And the interesting thing about corn is that it needs to be spread by the human hand. This is where the aspect of humans encouraging our own life-giving flowering. The sun and the earth, spirit and matter meet in the slightly buried seed. And this is because a human has sowed it. As in Corinthians it says, and that which thou sowest not that body that shall be, but bear grain, it may chance of wheat or some other grain. So also is the resurrection of the dead. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. Verily, verily, I say unto you, except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit. So humans scatter the grain and let it go down into the earth, which is like going into the death. But then it resurrects and becomes a natural body, which is a spiritual body. In that process of dying, it brings much fruit. And so like us, we need to, as in the spiritual life, the idea of letting go, of renouncing the ego, letting our best nature come forth so that we can be compassionate for others, that brings forth the fruit. So if you're familiar with the voice of the silence, there's the idea that the pilgrim who would cool his weary limbs in running waters, yet dares not plunge for terror of the stream, risks to succumb from heat. So we need to let go and be willing to die, be willing to put the seed into the ground, to risk everything, not near us, but cast out far from us. Like a corn plant has its seeds sown far away so that it can be propagated. Humans propagate these seeds in organized fashion, not just right near the plant, but far away. That's like the compassionate service of risking everything for the sake of others, taking the jewels of the seeds that we have and planting them for others so that the harvest increases. And we'll end with this quote from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Onward through leagues of sun-illumined corn, as if through parted seas, the pathway runs, and crowned with sunshine as the Prince of Peace, walks the beloved Master, leading us. So now we can have discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Kim, for that wonderful presentation and explanation about so many aspects of corn. The biological, the use by local American, North American indigenous peoples. That's wonderful. Well, I already see a few hands raised, and Kim, do you want to call on them? I saw, was it Judy
Hello?
first? Or Joseph? Yeah, I think we had Judy first there.
Oh,
Want to unmute yourself?
sorry. Okay, Judy then.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. There's a place in the Secret Doctrine. I was just looking for it where I think it mentions that wheat and corn were seeded from other planets, perhaps from a meteorite. Because I know there's a book that talks about protein change on meteorites. It's called Kinder des Weltalls. It was written in German, Children of the Universe. And is this one of the reasons perhaps that corn was so sacred to the Egyptians and apparently to the North American tribes?
Well, I don't know that passage exactly, but this student, when we read the Secret Doctrine, we in those sections on the early races, we think that it's talking about invisible forms. And so if the staff of life metaphorically came from other systems, that would make sense in globes, rounds, and races of evolution. The student doesn't think that it has to do with physical corn and physical wheat, though, coming from a physical comet. But that's just this person's understanding. If anyone else wants to share, they're welcome to about that. Does anybody have something about that they want to say?
Well, thanks for a great presentation.
Yes, thank you. And I am curious, how is it, Judy, in the book, which I had not heard of, that these German authors came up with the idea that these plants came from another part of the solar system, or maybe another part of the galaxy? I am aware of chondromalaceous meteorites that have carbon compounds on them that land on Earth. Were the Germans thinking of something along those lines?
Are you asking me or Judy?
Oh, actually, I was asking Judy about the book she referenced that's written in German.
Are you asking me about the passage?
Yes, and actually about that book you mentioned in German, were the authors
Children in English, Hoymar von Ditfurth. Hoymar von Ditfurth, and it's in English is Children of the Universe. I read it when it first came out in Germany. It's called Kinder des Weltalls.
Okay.
Children of the Universe. And I translated part of it for Henry Geiger. This was in 1970, and he published it in Manas.
Okay.
Yeah, Yeah, because it's quite theosophical. It goes von Differt, there's a German astronomer, but he talks a lot about the importance of meteors coming to the planet and what they carry with them.
Yeah, that's exactly my question. Were they referencing the meteors that have carbon compounds on them that land on our planet? Fascinating. Yeah, that's intriguing indeed. Appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you. I think Joe's got a comment.
Yeah, Joseph Miller. You're up
Thank
next.
you. Thank you, Kim. That was very interesting. I have a really basic question. When I go to the store, I make a distinction between sweet corn and popcorn. And for some reason, all my 60 years, I've imagined there must be like hard corn and then soft corn. And soft corn you put in a pot and you steam and you eat. And hard corn you might, grind up to make cornmeal, or you might pop. Is that a true distinction? Did the Native Americans have both kinds? Did they steam corn in pots? Obviously they must have had, I know they had popcorn and they ground corn. Anyway, enlighten me. Thank you.
The starch content of the kernel determines how it's used. If it has a certain amount, I think it's more, then it becomes a grinding corn for flour. And I think if it's less, then that's good for when it dries, becoming popcorn, because you want it popcorn when it gets toasted to have the moisture inside of it evaporate into gas and then suddenly burst out. And so, yeah, it depends on the starch content of the grain. So there's hundreds of varieties, and certain varieties are cultivated just for popping. Others are cultivated just for grinding, and others are like easily made for food for cows and pigs. And there's actually evidence. Some archaeologists think that popcorn was made as early as 60,000 years ago, which is pretty amazing. Robert?
I'm sorry, somehow I find this idea of popcorn humorous, but I'm trying to control myself. I wonder what your thoughts are about this symbolism of corn and the brotherhood of humanity, that link in the symbolism.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking that it's like kind of like how they make kids wear uniforms when they go do PE. Everybody wears the same uniform because then they're unified. Nobody's different, special. I think that the corn analogy is that they do look alike when you're looking at the field of corn. We know they're individuals, and yet they really do look similar. And so the unity of the cornfield to me is representative of that fundamental kind of ovoid sphere that surrounds us, that corn cob, that multi-centered, powerful kind of unit that each person is, which is also symbolic. The corn cob is symbolic of. And every corn cob looks like it has a similar kind of potentiality, but every individual kernel on every individual corn is unique. And especially in the multicolored corn, they will have different patterns. And yet the structure in a cornfield, it's all similar. So it's symbolic of that unity that we all have as human beings. We are all blessed and given the same opportunities of growth and the same potential centers of cognition and perception, and it depends on how we develop them, whether or not we're of any good use to the world. So yeah, so Maurice and Jenny.
But anyway, thank you very much. It's very inspiring presentation.
Oh,
Yes, Kim, thank you so much for your presentation. And your presentation kind of evoked the sacredness of life and the reciprocity and interdependence of life and the unity. So I hate to ask a question like this, but it is a modern issue, I guess, and that is obviously a lot of our corn seems to be something like GMO or something like that. And I don't totally understand it. I'm not sure all GMO is bad necessarily. So would you have any thoughts about that?
Hmm. Yeah. Oh boy. Well, with the reciprocity of agriculture and the staff of life, humans benefit from the staff of life, and yet we also modify it for our purposes. And with technology, we get more and more powerful tools to modify life forms. There's also what happens is the unintended consequences, where it's almost a law. Like anytime you think you're doing something good, there's some unintended consequence in every sphere, not only agriculture, but just everything, no good deed goes unpunished, they say. So I think it's like that. I mean, I know scientists who work in agriculture and sincerely believe that they're doing the right thing to like create Roundup ready crops, or BT corn has the gene in it that makes the caterpillars that eat the corn get a very bad digestive problem and die. So automatically then it's resistant to this worm that would be, or caterpillar that would be eating it. So that seems great. Just go ahead and grow the crop and it won't have that problem being eaten by caterpillars. But, there's always an unintended consequence. What are the side effects? Well, we don't know. Sometimes we do know. Scientists can study the immediate effects and say there are no known side effects now. And there's always a spectrum of how much people are willing to accept that as a basis for going forward. Some people are going to say there must be no negative side effects ever for 1,000 years of doing this before I will even touch it. Well, by that time, 1,000 years has passed. So there's a spectrum of, well, we do have to have a solution at some point. And at some point we have to decide, okay, this level of certainty is good enough for me. So I have mixed feelings about it. I think that I think it'd be better personally. I would rather not use GMO crops. I would rather treat the earth with respect and use integrative organic techniques and soil preserving techniques. Those are more labor intensive, and that requires a big ask of the culture. And it requires those who have more to give up a bit, because the agricultural revolution that had genetically modified plants and chemical fertilizers did produce a lot more food immediately for the countries. So people need the food, but the first world nations could probably give up about a lot more and allow organic methods to be the mainstream way to do it throughout the world. So that's a more global solution. I don't know if I answered your question.
Well, thank you, though. I mean, it really, I think, demonstrated kind of where we are and brought attention to the fact that what we eat, we are what we eat. So thank you.
Let me chime in there for a moment on unintended consequences. Given the age of this audience here, sure many were aware of the 1960s green revolution, in which plant scientists made high yield rice and things along those lines in order to reduce starvation on the planet. And we had about 1.5 or 2 billion people on Earth. So we got high yield plants, and then all of a sudden the unintended consequences. Now we have 8 billion people on the planet, and we still have starvation. So it's like, how do we? There's everything is so multifactorial. It's a fascinating question, and I have to say, back in 1978, I was for a few months, or almost a year, at UC San Francisco in the biochemistry department, and went on a retreat. The whole department went to Asilomar near Monterey. And we were reminiscing in 78 about the 1976 accord that lasted for about half a year, where scientists around the world decided they would never form chimeric organisms. This is before the GMO became a thing. They would never mix the DNA of one species with another. And that didn't last, but not even a whole year. And people say, now there's money to be made if we mix organisms together and their DNA together. But thank you for that presentation on the fascinating thing. So I think going from the C3 to the C4 plants will be clearly a mixture of different species DNA, and hopefully it will not have unintended consequences.
David, thank you, Ken.
Oh, right. Actually, before I was going to say, I wanted to say Roundup is a real poison, I think, and it could be replaced. And if we look at the obesity rates in this country and other things that are going on, we see we're really doing bad things to food overall. But what I want to talk about something really positive, though, about corn, which is one of the, as we all know, one of the biggest pollutants in the world, and it's showing up more and more now, and we use it everywhere, is plastic. It's in our food now, they're finding, and we know in the oceans and what it's doing to wildlife. Well, there's something called corn plastic. They make plastic from corn, and it's a non-petroleum, what do you call it? It's made non-petroleum material, I hear, and it's, I looked up a few statistics. It requires like 65% less energy, emits 68% less greenhouse gases. So I think maybe corn will be one of the hopes of the future for us if we really harness it and start using it in that way and get rid of petroleum plastics, which are really hurting things very quickly. So just another point about corn, I thought is pretty interesting.
Yes, that's very true. The technology of using corn for other uses than food is developing. I'm reminded of a friend of mine who has a old Volvo diesel car, and he modified it to literally accept corn oil as its fuel. Used corn oil from McDonald's that had been, embedded in French fries. So he goes to McDonald's, gets their spare oil, filters out the French fries, pours it into his old diesel engine, and toots along. And it smells like French fries behind him. And he's not creating any carbon from underground up. It's all cycling carbon up on the atmosphere surface. So no added to global warming.
Yeah.
Maluka?
Hi, good afternoon. It was a lovely presentation. I can see you did a lot of research. So this looked like a catch-22, because man continued to play to be a god and think about profit, power, and alteration. They do it with the vegetable, they do it with the animals, they do it with the humans, as you know, all these baby tubes and etc. It seems that comes back from the Egyptian time, because the Egyptian time did a lot of those things as well. So I think it's still in us to think that we can better things, make it better than nature. And I want to make no intent to offend anybody that meat eat, but they have some studies that say if we stop the meat consumption, we're not only we're going to help the climate, but also we will be able to use that land in which they have all these, cattle being fed. to raise, to start cultivating food to feed other human beings.
Mhm.
And that the Hopi, when they cultivated the corn, they said it was for helping themselves to feed themselves. It was not for any purpose of profit. And I think it's once again the motive. What is the motive?
Yeah, that's a very excellent point, Maluka. That's the challenge of our times. The selfish ego that believes it needs to put its impress upon the world and control the physical world around it and modify it for its own selfish purposes. It's what we're combating. And it's subtle too. I mean, we might think, oh, I'm so great. I'm not egotistical. I'm not participating in this, but we could deceive ourselves pretty easily. And so that's the challenge of every night in a mental review of our day. In what ways have I served the whole in such a way that lessens the impact on the earth and treats nature with respect and just takes what I need to sustain, and no more, keeping self-contained our own duty, and yet with a generous spirit of heart, accepting and being kind to others who have their own struggles. I know somebody who would see a woman in a Suburban, a big car, drive a block and then drive back, and he would get so angry at her because she was driving this big car for no reason, he felt. And it just seemed like, well, is that really helping? So I think it's important for us to be agnostic and understanding of the karmic situation that so many people are in. And it's hard. I mean, to not judge others, but offer good solutions as positive pathways. So anything we can do to support community organic farms and initiatives that do reduce the use of chemicals, any step in that direction is positive.
Well, again, Kim, thank you for this amazing presentation with all its different facets. And we certainly welcome any further comments or commentaries or observations about corn or even its symbology of the human body with that fascinating article you mentioned. And perhaps, Kim, you could tell us a little bit more about it. It's the one from Helen Valborg, which she was comparing part of the corn of an anatomy of a corn cob to the human physiology, especially the pineal.
Yeah. Why don't I just figure out my computer here? I'll go ahead and share it. Share my screen. Okay, so here's all you have to do is, I guess you can see my screen. Go to theosophytrust.org and then go to symbols. So theosophytrust.org and then go to symbols and then just kind of scroll down. There's two places I went to reference for this article. I went to the article on corn, and this is where you can read a lot about mythology of the Zunis and the Hopis and the Maya, the Aztecs, and it's really fascinating. And about the pineal gland. You know what? I'll bet if I just go like this, pineal. See, this might have been in. Okay. I also used the other article she has on the Staff of Life called Wheat. So, if I hit the back button, you get to watch my skill with computers here. Okay. QRSTUV. UV, keep going. Wheat. Okay. Then we go Control F, pineal. There we are. Okay, that's where I found it. It was in the wheat article. An intuitive artist or scientist might observe the emerging sprout as it reaches out of the earth towards the sun with its cone-shaped growing point, and even recall that the pineal gland is cone-shaped and that the ancient Aryans viewed it as the seat of the third eye. The simple farmer, acquainted with such thoughts, might then be inspired to recount the old story of the virgin goddess holding the spike of wheat and ascending to the center, around which the sun revolved, and so heralding the end of a great cycle. Here she's talking about the myth of Persephone and Demeter in Greek mythology. But yeah, I mean, here she gives analogies of looking at the process of germination and wondering about, okay, here the wheat kernel that has the fold in the middle, be reminded of the fontanelle of the human cranium. And then also one could think of speculating of the 5 roots that radiate out into the soil like a star and remember the shape of man in the world. So this is a really good article, wheat and corn.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. Appreciate that.
Sure.
Helps my awareness of that website as well.
Oh, Jonathan?
This isn't anything very profound, but it's just an example of how much like our world has become like a little village, a little rural village in the following way. I'm down here in Brazil, and they told me here that the Brazilian farmers are being asked to grow a lot of corn because of the Ukraine war, because of the farming, the fields and all that, all the destruction, but also the transportation, as you know, all that, just the logistics of the war, that all that transportation stuff's getting blocked. So that there's kind of a shifting going on for now. It's a very sad thing, but it reminds us just how small our little village is called this world.
Yeah. And like what Maluka was mentioning about slashing down the forest to grow corn and alfalfa or whatever for cows. It's so inefficient as far as creating food for humans, and it just messes up the rainforest, like destroys it.
It's interesting also, though, the potential for growing corn with not that much water per your presentation, the way I guess it was the Hopis, or that man the Zuni was talking about.
No, the Hopis. Yeah, that's right. Hopi dryland desert farming.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Like doing more with less.
Mm-hmm. With plants that are adapted to that as well.
Oh,
because remember, there's like 100 varieties of corn. Some are adapted to that kind of growth, and others are less so.
Another question for you there, Kim. Have you, in your research, has there come across the corn DNA issue of transposable elements? So apparently, part of the DNA of corn can move to another part of the of its chromosomes, so it'll give a different gene expression. And there was a woman, I forget her name at the moment, but she, as a biologist, discovered that I think in the 1940s or 1950s. And then afterwards, it was discovered that us in humans, we have transposable elements of our DNA in our immune system. So it's interesting that there's something that was discovered in corn that also happens in humans, that we can rearrange our DNA so that an individual white cell line can recognize a particular bacteria or particular virus.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing about scientific research, is the cross-disciplinarity of it, where a pattern or process in one field can if studied well, can actually be recognized in another field. And now here you're within the field of genetics, so that's not a big stretch. Like, oh, this happens with genetics here, it also happens with genetics in another species. That's understandable and not so surprising, but it is pretty amazing how cross-disciplinary things can be discovered. Like, I'm reminded of what was it? The calculus of, well, logarithms. I mean, those were invented to count codfish barrels in Dutch trading ships. So the mathematics of logarithms was developed just to find a quick way to count how many barrels of codfish there were as the Dutch were trading in the 1600s. But that same science then is used to create fractal patterns on a computer screen that are generated through self-iterated systems using imaginary numbers, and explain a lot of problems also in economics and in growth of bacterial populations and all kinds of things. So just that in the growth of understanding, one could learn something in one field and then apply it to a completely separate field. That's pretty amazing too. It looks like Meluka has her hand up also. And
Yes, Luca and Maurice, yes.
Hi again. I was thinking that one time I met a shaman. I think he was I think it was Hopi. And he said, they have all these, ancient meetings and all that. And he said, the reason we're so unhealthy and so violent is because we eat a lot of dead food. And obviously, I think that one of the philosophers also say, men are killing animals, soon they're going to start killing each other. So there is a connection there or disconnection. He said that if you eat fruit, organic food and like that, that's alive to begin with, it's more beneficial. And he said, really connect you with a great spirit. And I think it's less karma too.
yeah, thank you. That's a really good comment. It's true. Maurice?
Yes, I guess I was compelled to also say, just to acknowledge the fact that there's in different parts of the globe, there is seed saving, where people want to save the indigenous seeds and all the varieties, partly because of this capitalist concentration, where corporations decide they get patents on seeds and then own it and then control it and then manipulate it, et cetera, et cetera. But the positive side, I think, is a real recognition of the sacredness of the seed, of the bija. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. Yeah, the seeds are interesting because they contain an embryo of the entire plant in miniature. You can see the future leaves, future stem, future roots as a tiny miniature. And so universally they're like that, and yet they also have, to varying degrees, sustenance for that embryo. The kind of seeds that we tend to cultivate have a lot of sustenance for it. Like, imagine a pea, it's got a lot of starch there, or a corn grain. But they're universal in that sense, that they have the similar structure, an embryo and some degree of sustenance for it, and an encasing shell. Judy? I think, yeah.
Yeah, the secret
read it.
doctrine says something very interesting. about corn, volume 2, page 629, and it talks about the different colors of directions. It says, corn with grains of all colors on one ear represents the colors of the upper region of the firmament, with its rosy and yellow clouds, shining stars, etc. The speckled corn, each grain containing all the colors, is that of the priestess mother, woman containing in herself the seeds of all races, past, present, and future, Eve being the mother of all living. So it must be that the corn is pretty special, as you have pointed out, according to the secret doctrine, because it has the color of gold, of the upper regions of the stars.
I'm glad you found that passage to share. I had read it and was going to share it and then didn't
okay.
get into the presentation. But yes, that's it. What page is that? That's 628,
volume 2.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, the golden ear of corn is so representative of the higher spirit body that then is reflected in all the different centers of our physical form.
And I think also it's the color of the sun, which to the Zuni was very sacred. There's a Zuni hymn to the sun, which we used to sing in the Girl Scouts. And I won't sing it because I can't sing very well. But of course, this corn is very important to them too. So it's great that you mentioned their and showed their dance. It's really great.
Joe?
The article begins and ends speaking about the mid place, the midmost place. It was this ear of corn that was offered to the priestess who stood at the midmost place and represented all races, past, present, and future. And the article began by talking about the significance, as you stressed, about linking heaven and earth. I wonder if you had any thoughts about this midmost place and the priest who abides there, or I don't know, maybe it's the initial quotation from Zuni cosmology, maybe it's implying the creation of human beings, and human beings occupy this midmost place.
Well, let's all go figure this out, because I don't know. I'm going to share my screen and go to what he's talking about. Okay, so I think maybe you can see it. I'll try to make it bigger. Well, okay, so this is from the beginning of the corn article. Sky Father spoke to the Earth Mother and said, "Yet not alone there's some typos here, shalt thou be helpful unto our children, for behold," and he spread his hand abroad with the palm downward, and into all the wrinkles and crevices thereof he set the semblance of shining yellow corn grains. In the dark of the early world dawn, they gleamed like sparks of fire, and moved as his hand was moved over the bowl, shining up from and also moving in the depths of the water therein. "See," said he, pointing to the 7 grains clasped by his thumb and forefingers, "by such shall our children be guided. Far behold, when the Sun Father is not nigh, and thy terraces are as the dark itself, then shall our children be guided by lights, like to these lights of all the 6 regions turning around the midmost one. As in and around the midmost place, where these our children shall abide, lie all the other regions of space. Yea, and even as those grains gleam up from the water, so shall seed grains like to them, yet numberless, spring up from thy bosom when touched by my waters to nourish our children." Well, the idea that our children abide in the midmost place reminds us of Pico della Mirandola's point that man occupies the middle point of a ladder of being between the lowest and the highest, and then has the power of choice, where we can choose to incarnate ourselves dully as beasts, or towards the heavenly side and incarnate our divine nature. But I'm curious what other people think in the group. What is the significance of the midmost place, as Joe asks?
You know, it occurs to me as you read that, and we looked at it again just now, that perhaps this is sort of the Zuni parallel of speaking about the differentiation of the 7 major powers and of, you know, the 6 around the center. And perhaps it's the Zuni equivalent of what Theosophy speaks of as the Jian Chohans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes sense. Judy?
Well, I think to answer your question, the midmost place means we are capable of rising higher than the angels or falling low as the devils. But if we alone have been given free will, and that is what is so important in Oration of the Dignity of Man, that we have this choice and we are in the middle and we can climb as high as we want. There's no limit to us. That's what I think.
Thank you. And Ken?
Yes. I was thinking of Manas and how we can go to Kama Manas on the low end, or we can go to Buddhi Manas on the high end, and that Ataskarana or Antakarana, depending how you transliterate that, is that middle place that we can get to with our meditations and our studies. And we can either go further up in our evolution, in our incarnation towards the Buddhi Manas, or with our mind and our thoughts, stay more connected to the animalistic nature, the Kama Manas part of us as humans.
Thank you. DM, whoever that is.
Typically the number 4 is the most important number.
I can't hear you. I don't know if others can.
Typically the number 4 is very important to Native American, all Native Americans, different tribes, but it's based on the 7. So you have the 4 directions, then you have above and below, which would be Sky Father, Earth Mother. And then the 7th is the center. So I can't explain any more than that, but that's symbolically, that's an explanation for the 7 in the use of the number 7 in Native American cultures, and the prominence of the 4.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Makes sense. The invisible 7th point in the center. Judy, were you wanting to, is your hand up?
Oh, I just want to say that is covered in that secret doctrine passage that I quoted, volume 2, 628. The 4 directions and then the above, below, and center. So that's a very pertinent comment that she made. Thank you.
Thank you. Truth?
Well, I also was reminded of the middle way in Buddhism. So it reminded me 4 being a balance point. So, but I had a question also is what are the levels of interpretation in that tradition? Like in the Zuni tradition, what are their different levels of interpretation? Because, you know, in there are at least 4 levels of interpretation in the Christian tradition and in the Jewish tradition. And it seems to correspond with the 4 elements. You have the sense level of interpretation, like literalism. You have the emotional level of interpretation, which has to do with our relations, correspondences, relations between one thing and another. You have the air element of mind. So you have the mental level of interpretation, and then the fire, spiritual, which has to do with transformation. So I wonder, how does the middle correspond with the different levels of interpretation, I guess, in Native American culture?
It's an intriguing question. Don't really know what to say to that, except for that we will say the level of cognition that we bring to the subject is going to deeply and profoundly and completely affect our understanding. Our level of perception is related to our level of cognition. And if we haven't done our inner work on inner planes, we're not going to be able to perceive anything, even if all the wisdom of the world is spoken into our ears. We will not be able to understand the symbolism unless we've done that inner work of refinement within us. So that's all the student has to say about it. Very good question, Truth.
Well, thank you. And I was also intrigued by the previous response from, I think it's Helen. And so thank you for your presentation also.
Yes, Kim, thank you very much. We're at the top of the hour here. I think we should wind down. If you or others are willing to stay past 6 p.m. Pacific time, you're certainly welcome. I'll keep the Zoom room open. But others who need to sign off for dinner or whatever else you're doing today, that's perfectly okay to go ahead and sign off. I put into the chat the ULT meetup. It's a way to RSVP for upcoming events, and also you can get your name onto the email list. Obviously, this group is already on the email list, but I'm inviting you to tell your friends, colleagues, associates, any future or budding students of Theosophy that you may know that might want to find out about the San Diego ULT Aquarian Almanac, so we can grow our attendance. These are some pretty amazing presentations, and Truth and others are putting them on, Maria, are putting them onto a YouTube channel, so they're available after the recordings get edited. Kim, are you willing to stay a little longer? If there are any further questions, or shall we close up for today?
I'll stay if you want.
Kim, I just want to thank you very much.
Oh, sure. You're welcome.
Thank you.
Eileen? Or no?
I did see Eileen's hand.
Scared her away. Okay.
Oh yeah, maybe she was hitting the end button or the leave button and hit the hand up button instead. Yes, thank you again, Kim. And last call, any other questions or comments before we end the recording?
Thank you, Kim.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Kim, and keep up the good work, everybody.
Yeah, thanks everyone. It was a really great group.
Thank you, Kim.
Yes, I especially appreciate all the biology. I got a biology degree in undergraduate school, and I put Barbara McClintock's article in the chat as well. I heard about her back in '78 as a revered woman biologist from the 1940s.
Yeah, I think I heard some lectures of hers when I was in school. The
Right.
lab was active then.
Fantastic. Yeah. All right. And Truth, are you still there to end the recording, or do we need to end it formally?
It will end as we leave the meeting.
Okay, it ends automatically. All right. Fantastic.
Yes. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks again, Kim. Jonathan, I'm glad you could zoom in from Brazil. That's amazing.
It worked out.
Yeah, alrighty.
All right, hey, Ken, thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm glad it worked. All right, all the technology. All right, bye for now.
You guys later.